Alright, the moment of truth.
Oh no!
The LS7 in my Corvette Z06 exploded in September. I thought I was safe from the LS7 valve drop problem, but I was wrong. I was accelerating onto the highway in third gear. The oil temperatures and pressures were good. The valve dropped at about 4,500 RPM. The car was unmodified except for the common muffler mod and had 76,000 miles on it. The car never made any funny valve train noises or caused me to be concerned about the valves. I used the recommended 5W30 Mobile 1 for all oil changes. In my mind, the engine was higher mileage, and if the valves were going to drop, they already would have. The oil samples I sent in also made me comfortable that my engine was not part of the bad batch of misdrilled valve guides. I beat the hell out of this car on track this and last summer. Hot Kansas track days with 270-degree oil temps, track sessions lasting up to 40 minutes, just putting the car through the ringer. I felt comfortable because I was changing the oil, taking care of the car, and keeping an eye on the engine. Everything seemed fine. Nothing stood out that would make me second guess myself. Then all of a sudden, it just popped. This is a relatively well-known and documented problem with the GM LS7. Thousands of forum posts have been made regarding the issue going back to the late 2000s. GM, as well as outside firms like K-Tech and the Corvette Action Center, extensively researched the issue and determined that valve guide wear was the cause of the engine destruction. More specifically, the concentricity, better measured as runout, of the valve guides was out of specification. General Motors' response to the valve guide issue was completely insufficient. Over the course of the LS7 production, GM released several service bulletins outlining what dealerships and owners could do to address these faulty motors. These bulletins included conducting a wiggle test on the valves. You heard that right. GM told owners that they would take a race-derived engine, wiggle the valves back and forth, and tell you if your engine was going to explode. These wiggle tests were rarely done properly, and at best provide inaccurate results. To this day, GM corporate as well as LS7 engineers from the Z06 program are releasing confusing and contradictory information about the engines. The problem was never really solved, and GM never made right on it by at the very least providing owners with accurate information, let alone providing extended warranties. With that said, let's now see what runout means as it relates to a detail drawing. A detail drawing is a picture of a dimensioned part that allows engineers and designers to communicate with machinists. Here is our valve guide detail drawing. In preparing this part for production, we would have developed tolerances for each of these dimensions. Every dimension that has a value to it also has a tolerance, because no machining operation is perfect. In the past, the technical term you could have applied to the valve tolerance is concentricity. You may have heard this term before, but it's now outdated and is no longer practiced. Here is the old definition of concentricity. If that sounds confusing and difficult to measure, it's because it is. We would now use what's called runout. Runout not only controls the form, but it's easier to measure. One way to measure runout is to rotate a shaft with a dial indicator. The dial indicator will measure 0 if the shaft is round and cylindrical. Taking these measurements down the entire length of the shaft will give you the total runout. The total runout will be greater than or equal to the concentricity tolerance. That means that if your total runout is less than your concentricity tolerance, your part is good. The runout tolerance is applied to the valve in the valve guide. If either of these components was out of tolerance, then they should have been flagged and not installed in the engine. Unfortunately, this was not the case with the LS7. Valves and valve guides out of tolerance were installed, causing excessive engine wear. This wear would eventually cause the valves to fail, usually dropping them into the combustion chamber. When I purchased the car, I wasn't too worried about valve drop. From what I'd seen up to that point, I was under the impression, like Gwatney Performance, that valve drop was more likely to happen on a modified motor, especially with a camshaft upgrade. Gwatney Performance noted this in their valve drop research article. In addition to that, I purchased the car with 65,000 miles on it. I thought that if the valve was going to drop, it would have happened sometime in the last 16 years or 65,000 miles. This point got instilled in me even more as I tracked the car hard for a year, completing over 20 events. I thought that if the valve was close to dropping, it certainly would have happened while the car was at redline on track. I sent every oil change during my ownership to Blackstone Labs for analysis. I had changed and sampled the oil 42 miles before the valve drop happened and had a solid set of base samples to compare from. This gave me incredible data as it relates to detecting if oil contamination could predict valve drop. I contacted Blackstone Labs the day after the drop and discussed it with one of their chemists, Josh. Josh and I spoke about the situation and realized that I had one of the best samples possible for observing what contaminants would be flagged for an imminent valve drop. Blackstone even offered to do the sample analysis for free, as it would give them extremely valuable data. I heard back from Josh a few weeks later and was extremely surprised. He and I spoke on the phone for about 15 minutes, but let me read you the summary of what he wrote. Mike, there's no sign of impending trouble in this sample. Wear metals are mostly at their lowest on the page. Iron, from cylinder, shafts, and exhaust valves, is exceptionally good for a 5,200 mile oil use. Copper and tin, from bronze bushings and valves, are low, and titanium, from intake valves and connecting rods, is reading at 0 parts per million. Whatever led or caused the valve issue isn't apparent in the oil used 42 miles before failure. This information surprised me. I'm always someone who's trusted data. It made sense in my mind that we would have seen markers of contaminants prior to an engine problem like this. This LS7 problem reminds me of Porsche IMS bearing wear, and you don't read a single Bring a Trailer listing of a 996 without someone mentioning, what does the oil analysis say, if it hasn't been done. This situation definitely makes me question the real-world usefulness of oil analysis. So what actually happened to the car? It was making some great noises, and then it sounded like this. As a note, I was not inside of cylinder 1 during the failure. I don't have undeniable proof that the valve dropped. That's just what all of the symptoms are pointing towards. I heard the noise and pulled off the highway. I called AAA for a tow. They arrived, and the driver was worried about putting this low of a car on his flatbed. He was worried about scraping the front bumper. He ended up jacking the car onto some small 2x4 ramps. I showed him where to position the jack so it wouldn't damage the underbody of the car. Because the car was at an angle and the jack was resting on gravel, it slipped off and ripped a jack-sized hole through the rocker panel, the front door, and the front fender. That was unfortunate. I'll take half the blame for showing him where to position the jack, but it just sucks. Anyways, we tow the car back to Motive and unload it. Isaac meets me there. We peeked under the car a little to see if there was anything visibly damaged, and we noticed a crack in the block by cylinder 1. But it wasn't until we started disassembly that we got the full picture. The first thing that we removed was the intake. Yeah, that shouldn't be there. We knew something had gone very wrong. Isaac and I placed a bet on whether cylinder 1 still had its piston intact. I was hopeful.
Oh, greetings! It is I, the Count, and it's time to answer that fascinating question.
Small rocks are picked up as birds peck and feed. This mineral matter accumulates in the gizzard, and the particles help pulverize the seeds and grain.
Don't need it. I don't need it. I don't need it. I need it!
It was now time to remove the heads. As we pulled them off, we realized that Isaac had won the bet. So the engine is obviously toast. It will need a full replacement of some sort, and that replacement is yet to be decided. We could go with a lower displacement, higher RPM build. We could go with a stock, but replaced valve, LS7. We could go with a modified, higher horsepower LS7. We could go with a higher displacement, higher torque motor. Please let us know in the comments what you'd like to see from this build. You may have a better idea. We'd love to hear from you. This is our first large YouTube project at Motive, and we here have a lot more coming. So please be sure to subscribe to be notified of future uploads. And thank you so much for watching.